men have a sense of shame, but they're shamed for being wounded. If a woman is wounded, everybody's ready to go look for the victimizer.
Mm.
If a man says, I'm wounded, well, what kind of a spineless, lazy person are you? And so men news, particularly in my generation, you're not allowed to cry. You're not allowed to raise these things. You're not allowed to say, this is happening at school.
Oh, friends, today we are talking about a topic that I have never addressed on this podcast and that honestly isn't addressed very often. I'm speaking with Dr. Andrew Schmutzer. His story is going to touch your heart, I promise. Hi, friend. You're listening to Find Hope Here. I'm your host, Teresa Whiting, author, speaker, ministry leader, friend, and fellow struggler. This is a podcast about the messy, complicated, painful parts of life, but also the beautiful, joy-filled hope that Jesus promises. Each week, we dig deep into God's Word together and talk about how His truth impacts our everyday lives. I'm not going to ask you to sit with me and have coffee because I seem to have my best conversations while I'm just doing life. So I'd love to hang out with you as you walk or fold laundry or drive to work. You're invited to join me in pursuing the hope God promises. No matter where you are or where you've been, I pray you always find hope here. Let's jump into today's episode. Well, welcome, friends. I'm excited to introduce you today to Dr. Andrew Schmutzer. Dr. Schmutzer is a professor of biblical studies at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, which is how I first encountered him because my son is a student there. And when I was visiting, I had a number of students tell me, you need to talk to Dr. Schmutzer. So that's kind of how this whole thing got started. But he is a scholar and author of numerous books and also a male sexual abuse survivor. And so it's just an honor, Dr. Schmutzer, to have you on to speak with you. And so thank you for being here. And
Yeah, you're
before we
welcome.
jump in, can you just tell the listeners a little bit more about your background and who you are and what you do?
Sure. So, yeah, married, father of three, and been teaching Old Testament and Hebrew language, theology at Moody Bible Institute for about 27 years. Um, there's been a lot of change in my own life in a period like that, um, not least of which is leaning into my story.
Mm.
But anyway, we'll get into that. Yeah, I enjoy student life. I love interacting with students. The classroom is my joy. Um, we as professors have a bit of a joke sometimes. I'll teach for free. It's everything else I will get paid for, and that's really me. I love the classroom. I love teaching. And I decided to write a bit about abuse because of I think a lack of writing out there, particularly from a Christian perspective that acknowledged faith, that hadn't abandoned it or kicked it to the curb. There was there wasn't a lot out there that could speak to me, and certainly as a male survivor, there's not a whole lot out there for men. So I grew up as an MK, which means missionary kid, and born and raised in South Africa, born in Durban, and grew up inland at a mission hospital. So it was a
Mm.
very, very Huckleberry Finn life for the older sector of the audience. It was fun. It was a riot. But that's part of the reality that we as survivors deal with too. Just to segue off for a moment, because the fish don't know the water's wet,
Mm.
and you often don't know what you don't know until something comes in sideways, and you have to face realities that you've either redefined or were ignorant of in certain ways, or simply were viewing through a different lens. And so, yeah, came to the States when I was 12 and jumped into American junior high.
Oh, wow.
And African culture. Yeah, it was a bit traumatic in its own way.
Yes.
I leaned into my athletic prowess. I could do things that others couldn't, whether it was throwing rocks with accuracy or whatever. But that was my identity as a young child and as a teen and preteen. What I could do athletically, and
Mm-hmm.
eventually I had to, ironically, face the fact that the body does keep the score, and there's things that you have to factor in address and healing
Mm-hmm.
that are very somatic, very body related. And this is important, particularly for Christians, to learn not to cordon off the body.
Mm.
And so, my biblical studies, anthropology, was an enormous aid to me. I, in one sense, I knew too much to kick the faith to the curb. It wasn't that simple, but I did need to use a guy's metaphor, I did need to strip the car down, blast the paint off, sand it down, and then rebuild the car from the ground up. But it wasn't a question of am I still dealing with a car? It was a question of how am I supposed to drive it? What is it supposed to look like? What does it mean for me to be behind the wheel again of my life, my autonomy, myself? And so those are a lot of things that I began to address much later in life, particularly as somebody 58 now. Nobody ever talked about abuse when I was a child, when I was in college, even grad school and university. It was never a conversation
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
was brought up. I've learned over the years too, while that's lamentable and one might even say tragic, particularly for those going into ministry. I teach pastors as well.
Right.
The professors and mentors and teachers I had didn't know how to direct somebody where they had never been themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a justification, that's an explanation. And so I have learned to, I think, walk between the initial stages of anger and the later stages of pity.
Mm-hmm.
I think therein is a massive arc of healing for Christians. It's not denying anger. It's not saying everything's honky dory. I'm clearly going to say it's not. But I think there is a development that processes anger, particularly for male survivors. Not that females can't have anger, but there's a certain dynamic of anger that lives with male survivors for complex reasons.
Right.
So when I was 37, my wheels began to come off, and yeah, we can get into some of that, but that's some of my background. You can
Wow.
ask if you'd like.
I appreciate that. And I
Well,
did want to hear if you're willing to just share a little bit more of your story.
yeah, no, that's fine. My abuser is still living, and so I'm not going to mention the name, but it was a family member. And so when I hit 37, like I said, my wheels began to come off for certain reasons. And I remember walking into a therapist's office. I didn't even have an appointment. I knocked on a door and the door was open. And I said, I have a story to tell you, and you're going to have to tell me how it ends because
Mm.
I have no idea how to process this. I have no idea what to do with it. And I was starting to recognize the category of abuse, the reality of abuse. That's one of the unique things I think about healing and the trauma story for survivors. People need to understand that sexual abuse is a certain category of sexual violence. We're not talking about having necessarily been raped in college. We're not talking about other forms of attack. All these things are horrific and horrible, not the issue. But when a child is sexually abused, you're in the developmental years,
Mm-hmm.
and the brain will do anything in its power to make meaning and make sense in that child's limited worldview, limited vocabulary, limited understanding, with no social power, as we love and the secular world loves to talk about. And so this child is going to make meaning of it as best as they can. And so that's one of the unique things that people really need to understand about sexual abuse. And so for me, it started at age 12, and I had no idea what was going on, and continued really for a number of years until I left for college.
Mm.
And I remember coming back and confronting my abuser and saying, I heard a chapel message from a social worker about things that should not happen and things we need to be aware of on the street. And I now realize what happened in my own life.
Mm.
And I think this is one of the most horrific realities that a lot of survivors face. And I'm going to take that to another level, what a lot of incest survivors face. The stranger danger is a mythology for survivors of sexual abuse. I think the statistics are 80% plus. Abuse survivors are abused by family members, by people who know them, by people who have access to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that brings out an extreme betrayal element
Yes.
because the child wants to trust them, doesn't know how not to trust them. And so there's another whole layer going on here. And it's not as simple as get the monkey off your back, take them to court, sue them for all the money that they have, go on with your life, live through your rage, hear me roar. These are a lot of mantras that society revels in, but actually they don't bring healing.
Mm.
They bring an identity, largely of anger, that is never processed, never has closure. The redemptive horizon of healing is something that Christians and the church really ought to lean into for their own people, as well as admit the fact they have the resources to address this. I think when it was denied after I confronted my abuser, and I realized I was dealing with a reality in which what we would call your story. My story was not acknowledged. It was completely disregarded.
Mm.
It was nullified. In fact, it brought about antagonism. Well, this is just mind blowing to a survivor. And so, because I'd never gotten help for it in any sense of it,
Mm-hmm.
it came out later in life. I had anger issues that a lot of male survivors struggle with as they try to process this internal combustion, this internal terrorism. And I will say, as a male survivor, society doesn't help here.
Mm-hmm.
There are no national support groups for men. I mean, there are a few. There weren't then, but I mean, they're not publicized. There's 1 in 6. There's male survivor, but nothing is made obvious, clear, or promoted for men.
Right.
No posters. There are no parades. There are no T-shirts. And this is part of what really puts men behind in healing for this. And so for my generation, it's not going to come up in premarital counseling. It's not going to be addressed in our childhood, even in a Christian background. Um, and so you're really left with, suck it up. If your victimizer is a male, well, then you need to be a soldier and soldier through. If your victimizer is a female, well, then how in the world did you let that happen?
Mm.
So guys never have this kind of welcoming environment of let's go to the church basement and talk through our support group. And that's not how guys process, and that's not how they feel drawn into talking about their story.
Hmm.
But if I have a six pack in a man cave in a garage with a whole bunch of tools, a Harley Davidson, and a TV in the corner, I can pack that thing out with male survivors because everything in that environment and the metaphor speaks their language of I don't have to apologize for having a child within me.
Mm.
I don't have to apologize for having a sensitive side. I don't have to apologize for being prone to crying, a man might say. But this is relatively recent. And so what you have is a lot of fathers and husbands who even pastors, Christian leaders who've never faced their story.
Yes.
And why would they? Their teachers never named it. It's never mentioned. Sexual violence month in April. I mean, what is said for male survivors? 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men. And we know men don't even talk. So we don't even know what the numbers are.
Right.
But men process this in much more physical ways. Their abuse tends to be a bit more gruesome, a bit more testing of their male profile. And if they don't get help, they they often tend to abuse or blow through boundaries in their own life.
Hmm.
Drug abuse, a lot of anger issues, a lot of things that spouses need to be made aware of. And
Yes.
kind of like an alcoholic story profile, it's really the family that has colluded with it because they'll cover for the abuser. They'll excuse what the abuser did. They'll redefine what the abuser did. And in that sense, it's really the dysfunctional family that hold a host of symptoms behind the survivor's story. So, with abuse, you often have aspects of physical violence, emotional violence, things like this, even what we call non contact sexual abuse, pornography issues. These are a lot of issues that men tend to have in their stories and very little opportunities to
Hmm.
process.
Yes.
And this is part of what, for me, at 58, I had to find this retrograde. I had to backfill all of this help and try to come up with it myself while living and staying in a Christian community.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And, I want to kind of go back to something that you referenced. And you are a biblical scholar. Like, can you talk a little bit about some of the books
Sure.
you've written? Because I want the listeners to understand the framework that you're coming from. But then
Mhm.
also you referenced the book The Body Keeps the Score, which is a more recent work,
It
which
is.
is honestly controversial among some Christians. They feel like, oh,
Sure.
that's a secular thing and we shouldn't be looking at that, which
Yeah,
I really feel like that book has been a tremendous help to me. So I'd love to hear you talk about how you hold these two things together, the
absolutely.
theology and
Yeah,
also the psychology or the recent research or however you want to
that's
term
right.
that.
That's right.
You seem to have appreciation for both.
I do. I do. And I'm well aware of how both ends, uh, you know, frankly, from the Josh Duggar approach of he's working with an elder, um, let's read scripture, let's pray. I get that. I have a lot of wonderful Christian friends that are, you know, biblical counseling only. Um, I That's not where I'm at. Yes, I love the Bible. I know it, I support it, and I teach it. Not the issue. I think we're living in a time of reductionisms when it's everything boiling down to this, nothing but this. So yeah, I mean, I probably went into Old Testament studies because I understood and gravitated toward a very cosmic and spiritual worldview growing up in Africa, which is a um, very spiritual, um, pantheistic, as well as just very somatically oriented, a very what you see is what you get. They're not going to philosophize about things or get lost in their head in their Christian worldview. Um, I think for all kinds of reasons like that, particularly through a child's eyes, the Older Testament made a unique kind of sense to me, and that's led in recent years to a lot of study in the Psalms,
Mm.
where I do a lot of writing, including on lament for obvious reasons. Lament
Yes.
helped keep me alive and keep my faith on track. So, from graduate school to my doctoral work, it's been deeply entrenched in biblical studies. Most recently, I've had a piece come out with Glenn Miles, who is a key editor out of the UK, and there I talk about various patterns of sexual violence within Old Testament stories, which whether you're thinking about the violence that the citizens of Sodom wanted to do with the two men, they make their intention very clear, bring them out so we may have sex with them. Or whether you want to talk about the date rape type scenario of Dinah in Genesis 34, or the way Lot's daughters incest him in
Mm.
Genesis 19. There's a lot of stories, as my point, that we tend to focus on a key individual or a key snippet. But when we look at the wider splay of the story, there's often a kind of familial, tribal, not our political tribes, tribal, even national conflict that emerges. Civil war practically breaks
Mm-hmm.
out. And so to look at these stories within the wider chaos that emerges within families, here's David, right?
Yep. Yep.
Second Samuel 11, and God's forgiven him, right? Nathan tells him that. But there's going to be a splitting of his kingdom. But
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be, civil war. But what he did in private is going to be done in public. The question isn't even, does God forgive? Obviously. Is there a kind of closure and healing of a type? Yes. But forgiveness does not remove consequences.
Right.
And that's been a huge problem for contemporary faith, which doesn't know how to move from God forgives, whether as perpetrator or as victim, to now I'm living in the debris field of consequences.
Mm-hmm.
So, all that just to say, I'm kind of combining a little bit of what I've studied, what I've written, where my life works. I decided to take some of my time, my energy, and my sanity and pour it into issues of sexual violence at a more popular level, dealing with abuse. And in other ways, I've written some things for men and male survivors.
Mm-hmm.
So, The Long Journey Home was published in 2011, and that is 28 essays by men and women, psychologists, pastors, counselors, therapists, survivors, theologians, addressing how do we minister to those who are abused from a very holistic perspective.
Mm.
And then later on in 2015, I believe it was, published a book with some other male survivors in a support group I was in called Naming Our Abuse. And
Yes.
there just tried to kind of zero in on the male archetype of what we struggle with, how we process our trauma, how we view our story, what is working well, what is not working well, what are we learning to deal with proactively, what is clearly going to be an ongoing struggle. And so that, along with some other things, good grief, I'm not used to talking about my writing like this. Um, but you raise the issue of these multiple disciplines, like Van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps Score. Within the secular worldview, there's a number of presuppositions they have. They're focused on the self, as they love to call it, the self. What's happened in quasi secular writing, I'm not used to using those terms, but writing that has nothing to do with faith.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, most of those writings, you're hard pressed to even find anything of faith in the topical index. They're not trained in theology. They don't have a divinity background. Many of them are not even attending a mainline church. And if they did, it's long in their rearview mirror now. So what they'll often do is they focus on what I would call an unembedded self. It's you, and this comes out, with great rage in secular therapy. It's how to prepare the client to avenge their injustice,
Mm.
and so boundaries are almost used as weapons. And there are important things that they raise, but it's entirely anything of faith or theology is eviscerated from it
Mm-hmm.
because of their antagonism to institutions, to historic faith. I'm well aware that the church is not perfect. There is no perfect institution. I'm well aware of that. But what's happened is throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I know. And so while there's enormous amount of significance, I think, in what Judith Herman, generation before, um, writing on trauma, and then Van der Kolk in The Body Keeps the Score, it's honoring the physical suffering and the dynamic of trauma as it interacts with everything from neurology to the muscularity to the endocrine to hormones, et cetera, all about the body. Conservative Christianity, on the other end, has tended to avoid that discussion in a kind of dualism. Here's my body, but my mind and my heart is fine with Christ. Well, that's really a sad dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
Which side of the scissors cuts the paper? We are embodied creatures, particularly as those redeemed in faith, where now our very body is slated for the resurrection. Paul makes this very clear. Don't you know that your body is also bought with a price? To the secular world, in its infatuation with autonomy, with independence, with freedom, what you've ended up with, though, is a kind of physicalism that focuses so much on the body as if they'll say the spiritual exists, but they don't want to define it. And so a lot of these people, while having wonderful insights in terms of trauma, we can learn a lot from that. But we're going to have to bring also the commitments of faith to the effects of trauma. And Christians are starting to do a lot of good work with this as well. But
Mm-hmm.
both ends of the spectrum historically have tended to talk as if the other side doesn't exist.
Or that the other
And
side is just flat out wrong and should be
fair enough,
avoided fully.
fair
So
enough.
I really appreciate your willingness to bring both sides together because personally I have found that has been really beneficial in a
Yeah,
healing journey of acknowledging the spiritual and the
right.
physical together as
Correct.
God created us, physical and spiritual and mental and
Imagine
emotional and
that.
all the things, that's how he created us. So,
Exactly.
um,
Exactly.
I talk a lot on the podcast about shame. I've talked to a lot of women who have endured all kinds of abuse. And I imagine that for men, it's different. So you've touched a little bit about how it's
Uh-huh.
different for men and women, and even how society supports women so much more fully than they support
Right.
men. But what
Right.
is that like for a boy, for a man? What that does to your manhood, the sense of shame that men carry, how is that different from women?
There isn't a social net that has really a working category for male abuse shame. It doesn't really exist.
Mm,
Masculinity today is something to be dismantled. Society uses men and masculinity as a foil to talk about violence, as a foil to talk about aggression. So women today are known for putting up boundaries. But if a man tries to put up a boundary, well, then he's controlling.
mm,
If a woman tries to stand up for the self, uh, well, then she's empowered. If a man tries to stand up or say no to a proposition or whatever, well, then he's narcissistic. And there is no category left within society, and the church isn't that far behind it. Sadly, Teresa, way too much of the water is in the boat
mm,
when it comes to the church.
yeah.
So there aren't many terms and categories and bomb shelters left for a man to process abuse like shame.
Hmm.
And so a lot of the symptoms, and here I can bring in some illustration from the church too. The church likes to address the symptoms. Oh, there's a pornography issue. The marriage isn't going well. There's an anger problem over here.
Mm,
Maybe there's too much drinking. Maybe there's whatever, even codependency. A lot of these things, though, yes, while they need to be addressed, are actually symptoms of deeper issues. And it's really, really hard for a man to stand up, particularly in my generation, to stand up and say, "Oh yeah, I was abused. I was abused sexually for a number of years, and there was nothing there for me, and yeah, anger issues, and struggle to be the parent that I want to be now." Really? Why did you let that happen when everything is a test of agency, right?
mm,
Everything's a test of agency. Well, a man is largely cast as an agent of chaos, of extremism, of fighting, of that's why we riddled up the boys, right?
mm,
In our generation, because it doesn't fit the decorum of the largely female world and the female teachers and the lot of female mentors and whatnot in a boy's life. And so, yeah, I mean, not to throw out too many bombs, but the Barbie movie hasn't helped really define masculinity for men of my generation or of the younger generation as well.
yeah.
It
I
hasn't.
haven't seen the movie, but I heard not great things about it.
Yeah, we can talk more offline on that one. It hasn't helped clarify who women are, who men are, particularly from a Christian worldview.
Hmm.
And so men have a sense of shame, but they're shamed for being wounded. If a woman is wounded, everybody's ready to go look for the victimizer.
Mm,
If a man says, I'm wounded, well, what kind of a spineless, lazy person are you? And so men news, particularly in my generation, you're not allowed to cry. You're not allowed to raise these things. You're not allowed to say, this is happening at school. No boy would do that. And so that raised an entire generation of which Gen Z and well, starting with millennials, but Gen Z has certainly swung all the way to the other end of the spectrum, where now they're not even sure what the differences are between men and women. And as you see in the transgender movement, men trying to put on female body like it's a coat. It's whatever you want to define it, but there's no respect for innate differences. And I guess mine would have been one of the last generations that said no, that there are differences. There are key differences. They need to be understood. They need to be respected. And we need literature. We need sermons. We need poetry. We need therapy and support groups that understand these differences, not talking to us like we're potential rapists.
Mm.
Yeah, you're not going to get a lot of guys talking then.
Mm-hmm.
So there are complex forms of shame that manifest themselves in other ways, forms of aggression, video gaming. A lot of guys are into video gaming, particularly in our children's generation, because the rest of the real world isn't safe.
Yeah.
But in this world, the gaming world, they can interact with it in a way that makes sense to them. So a lot of men have checked out because their form of grief, of pain, of fear, of shame is not acknowledged as legitimate.
Well, friends, I'm going to break in here and interrupt this conversation, but I promise next week's conversation is just as powerful. So please come back. I want to thank you for being here, for listening, for being the kind of person that cares about these sensitive topics. And the other thing I want to ask of you, I know that typically my audience is women. I want to ask you to spread this podcast. Text it to the men in your life, because you know what? There could be men in your life with childhood sexual abuse that they have never spoken aloud. Let's spread the word that this is a problem, but there is healing available. So please take the time right now. Text this episode to the men in your life. Thanks for hanging out with me today on Find Hope Here. To find anything I mentioned on the episode, go to teresawhiting.com/listen. That's where you can find all the show notes. And remember to hit that subscribe button. If you want to go the extra mile and leave a review, that would be amazing and it would mean so much to me. I'd like to leave you with this prayer from Romans 15:13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that by the power of the Holy Spirit, you may abound in hope